Long before our oceans settled into their present limits, there was a season when abundance tipped into something else, a living system so saturated with energy that even giants could hunt giants without breaking it. And in that crossing, it built Livyatan. Along the coast of Peru, stone held the imprint of teeth meant to meet bone. Both jaws carried them, not shaped for suction in the dark, but for impact against bodies nearly its own size. This was no isolated anomaly. It was a stable design, repeated and sustained. Whales were not distant wanderers then. They were pursued the way large land animals are pursued on open plains. Beneath every great predator lay plankton. When currents lifted nutrients toward the light, energy accumulated, layer upon layer, until specialization could harden into permanence. During the Miocene, that accumulation endured. Coastlines flourished, food webs thickened, and excess moved through the system with structure. Apex hunters are not symbols of balance, they are evidence of surplus. Water absorbs force. To crush bone within it demands reliable prey, long stability, and seasons that do not falter. Such anatomy forms only when loss can be repeated without fracture. Nothing in today's oceans reflects that margin, not because evolution diminished, but because the flow that once sustained it has thinned. The sea remains vast, but what it permits has narrowed. The fossil record remembers what the living water does not display. But what kind of ocean allows predators to specialize in killing other whales? What changed in the ancient seas that made this level of violence possible? How did an ecosystem sustain routine loss at such a scale without collapsing? And why did this threshold disappear completely, never to return? Tonight, we follow the evidence left in stone, not to chase a monster, but to understand the limits of a planet. But before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time is it there. It's always a joy to see how far these sleepy stories drift across the world. And if these gentle journeys bring you peace, a like or subscribe helps others find their way here too. Now, let your breath slow, let your body settle, and together let's sink gently into the prehistoric seas. Before teeth hardened into weapons and bodies stretched toward their largest forms, the ocean made a quieter decision. It determined how much light would be gathered, how deeply nutrients would circulate, how steadily currents would rise from the cold dark into illuminated water. Long before any predator tested its strength, this balance of movement and sunlight set the boundaries of what could live and what could not. Energy in the sea does not begin with muscle, it begins with drift. Microscopic plankton float near the surface, turning dissolved minerals and sunlight into living matter. They are nearly invisible, yet they form the first conversion of light into substance. In their brief, multiplying lives, they assemble the foundation upon which every fin, fluke, and hunting strategy depends. When plankton flourish, the effect does not remain small. Their abundance feeds swarms of zooplankton, which in turn sustain fish, which gather into shoals, dense enough to darken the water. From these moving veils, larger hunters draw steady meals. Growth becomes possible, then specialization. Bodies refine toward particular prey. Teeth shape themselves to bone or flesh. Migration patterns stabilize. Reproduction becomes reliable. Excess energy travels upward through the layers, thickening each tier without exhausting the one below. If that upward flow weakens, the contraction moves in the opposite direction. The smallest fluctuations in nutrient supply ripple quietly at first, reducing plankton blooms, thinning fish schools, lengthening the distances between successful hunts. The largest hunters feel this tightening most sharply. Their size demands frequent reward. Without surplus below, their scale becomes a burden. They fade before the mid-level feeders do, not because they are flawed, but because they depend upon abundance that no longer accumulates. For this reason, apex predators are not declarations of dominance, they are signatures of excess. Their presence reveals an ocean with more energy than the base requires for stability alone. Such systems can afford experimentation at the top. They can sustain hunters that target other giants, absorb the losses such encounters bring, and continue without fracture. These conditions do not last indefinitely. Ocean currents shift with climate, continents move, polar ice expands or retreats. Each alteration reshapes how nutrients cycle from depth to surface. When circulation strengthens, windows of opportunity open. When it slackens, they close. Certain forms appear only during these brief intervals when energy climbs high enough to permit them. In the Miocene, circulation and warmth aligned in a rare configuration. Nutrients rose with unusual consistency along coastlines and across open basins. Plankton blooms stretched wider and endured longer. From that foundation, food webs stacked higher than they do now, allowing predators to evolve into shapes that modern seas no longer support. The ancient ocean entered a window of surplus, and within it extraordinary possibilities took form. Desert cliffs along the southern coast of Peru rise in pale layers above a quiet shoreline, far removed from the deep water they once bordered. Within those sedimentary bands, formed in a sea long vanished, workers uncovered something that did not resemble the slender conical teeth of living sperm whales. These were thick, heavy, built not for grasping soft prey, but for meeting resistance. Even before the jaw was reconstructed, their proportions suggested impact. Each tooth carried enamel suited for pressure, broad at the base and tapering toward a robust tip. Wear patterns indicated repeated force against hard surfaces. Unlike modern sperm whales, whose lower jaws hold functional teeth while the upper jaw remains largely socketed, this ancient predator bore large teeth in both jaws. When aligned, they formed a formidable closure, a clamp capable of distributing stress across bone rather than yielding to it. Such symmetry changes the geometry of attack. It turns a ramming predator into one that grips and crushes. The surrounding fossils strengthen the interpretation. Fragments of baleen whalebone preserved alongside the remains bore scoring consistent with deep bites. The spacing between gouges matched the intervals of those massive teeth. This was no drift feeder filtering plankton, nor a specialist probing darkness for squid. The skull architecture pointed toward forward-facing strength, musculature anchored for powerful closure, the entire cranium shaped to withstand torque. In water, where resistance diffuses sudden force, crushing bone requires both size and reliability. Anatomy reflects expectation. Predators do not evolve such equipment for rare opportunities. Repeated success must have reinforced the design. To pursue other whales, creatures that move through open water with speed and endurance, demands confidence in encounter rates. The ocean that held this hunter did not present occasional windfalls, it offered sustained access to large prey. Energy moved through the food web in volumes sufficient to support a carnivore targeting animals of comparable mass. No single fossil captures the full animal, yet the pattern assembled from teeth, jaw fragments, and associated prey remains outlines a lifestyle unmistakably specialized. This predator was constructed for confrontation rather than opportunism. It did not wait for collapse or decay. It intercepted living bodies, applied force designed to fracture, and consumed tissue made accessible by that break. Such a strategy carries costs. Growth to that size requires years of nourishment. Maintaining that mass demands regular intake. The existence of this morphology suggests a sea capable of absorbing constant predation among giants without destabilizing its lower layers. The evidence rests in mineralized curves of enamel and bone, preserved in stone far from the tides that once carried them. Through those fragments, the ancient ocean reveals that it once supported a hunter bold enough to treat whales not as rivals, but as routine prey. Across living seas, marine mammals follow a quieter blueprint. Most rely on suction, speed, or filtering. Their teeth, when present, are slender, adapted for gripping soft bodies that yield under pressure. The architecture of crushing, common among certain land predators, seldom appears beneath open water. Density and drag soften impact. Force disperses quickly when delivered through a fluid medium, and bone resists without the sharp leverage gravity provides on land. For a marine mammal to evolve teeth capable of fracturing solid skeletal structures, other conditions must align with unusual precision. Water alters physics. A bite delivered in air can concentrate weight and momentum in a single instant. In water, resistance absorbs part of that impulse, reducing the efficiency of blunt force. To counter this, an animal must increase size, reinforce its jaw with dense muscle attachments, and anchor those muscles within a skull thick enough to withstand recoil. Teeth must broaden, enamel must thicken, and roots must seat deeply to prevent fracture. This is an expensive design. It requires years of nourishment to build and constant intake to maintain. Such traits do not emerge in scarcity. Reliable prey must be present in numbers sufficient to reward specialization. A predator that commits to crushing bone cannot pivot easily to softer targets without losing advantage. Its success depends on encountering animals large enough to justify the investment in mass and strength. That level of predictability implies prey populations that are themselves stable and abundant. Without that steadiness, the cost of maintaining such anatomy would outweigh the benefit. Starvation risk also shapes design. Large bodies move more slowly to maturity and reproduce less frequently. Their survival strategy assumes that the environment will not fluctuate sharply year to year. Long-term environmental stability becomes as critical as prey availability. Currents must deliver nutrients with consistency. Breeding grounds must endure. Climate must remain within narrow limits that support layered food webs beneath the predator. Bone-crushing teeth therefore signify not only aggression but confidence in the future. In modern oceans, this combination is absent. Many whales rely on filter feeding, others hunt agile prey that can be subdued without structural damage. Apex predators today tend toward cooperation or efficiency rather than brute force. Energy flows through systems that have become comparatively lean, with less surplus available at the highest tiers. The appearance of a marine mammal, built explicitly to break the skeletons of other giants, stands in quiet contradiction to present conditions. That contradiction sharpens the meaning of the fossil. The anatomy records a moment when size and certainty could coexist at an extreme rarely permitted by marine systems. The teeth endure as mineral testimony to an ecological arrangement that current oceans no longer reproduce. There are periods in Earth's history when warmth alone does not define the sea. Temperature shapes currents and coastlines, yet productivity depends on something deeper: the steady circulation of nutrients drawn upward from the abyss. During the Miocene, that circulation achieved a rare efficiency. Continents occupied positions that encouraged broad, unobstructed flow. Winds strengthened seasonal mixing. Along continental margins, cold water rich with dissolved minerals rose repeatedly toward the light. These upwelling zones were neither isolated nor brief. They appeared along long stretches of coastline, forming persistent corridors where surface waters shimmered with microscopic growth. Sunlight met nitrogen, and phosphorus lifted from the depths, and phytoplankton multiplied in thick, sustained blooms. Each bloom represented a conversion of chemical potential into living tissue. When such events occur often and across wide regions, they reshape entire basins. From these bright layers, zooplankton proliferated, then small schooling fish, then larger pelagic hunters. The chain did not thin as quickly as it does today. Energy moved upward with relatively little interruption because supply at the base replenished itself with dependable rhythm. Seasonal pulses did not collapse the system, they strengthened it, providing repeated surges that reinforced breeding cycles and migratory patterns. Biomass accumulated across multiple tiers at once, creating food webs both tall and wide. Warmth contributed, yet it was the combination of circulation and nutrient renewal that made the Miocene distinctive. Warmer surface waters can stabilize the upper ocean and inhibit mixing. But during this interval, wind patterns and continental arrangement counterbalanced that tendency. Currents distributed productivity across open waters and along margins, preventing concentration in only a few isolated pockets. The result was not erratic excess, but distributed plenty. Abundance alone does not guarantee complexity. Without structure, growth can become unstable, leading to boom and decline. In the Miocene seas, however, the architecture of currents and coastlines maintained coherence. Spawning grounds remained predictable. Forage species found consistent refuge and feeding areas. Large animals could migrate along nutrient-rich pathways that endured across generations. Stability allowed organisms to refine their roles within the system rather than remain generalists. When energy accumulates in such a structured environment, specialization becomes viable. Predators can focus on particular prey because those prey persist in reliable numbers. Filter feeders can expand in size because blooms recur with sufficient frequency to sustain them. Even interactions among giants become embedded within a broader framework that absorbs their demands. The ocean does not strain under their weight, it sustains them. This was the character of the Miocene Sea. It was warm, yet more importantly, it was provisioned. Nutrients cycled efficiently from depth to surface and back again, sustaining layered communities across vast distances. In that sustained flow, the upper reaches of the food web found room to expand beyond the limits seen in more constrained oceans. In the Miocene seas, whales did not yet occupy the quiet, unchallenged heights they hold in many modern oceans. Their lineages were diverse, their forms varied, and many species were smaller than the massive baleen giants familiar today. They traveled in numbers, scattered across productive basins, feeding along routes shaped by seasonal currents and shifting coastlines. Diversity brought success, yet it also meant that no single defense dominated the open water. Some bore baleen plates adapted for filtering dense swarms of prey. Others retained teeth suited for grasping fish. Body sizes ranged widely, but few reached the immense proportions that later generations would attain. Even among the larger forms, speed and coordination were still evolving strategies rather than perfected ones. The social structures seen in certain modern species were less pronounced. Many species relied more on abundance and dispersal than on tight cooperative groups. In such a setting, whales became predictable components of the upper food web. They followed migratory paths that repeated each year. Calving grounds formed along sheltered margins. Feeding zones shifted with productivity, yet the rhythm endured long enough for attentive predators to learn their timing. Instead of representing the top of the hierarchy, these early whales occupied a tier that could be accessed from above. The effect was subtle but profound. When a group of animals becomes both numerous and dependable, it transforms from competitor to resource. Large marine predators did not need to rely exclusively on smaller prey or specialized strategies. They could intercept whales in transit or target juveniles within nursery grounds. Over time, this consistent interaction exerted selective pressure on both sides. Whales began to trend toward larger body sizes, thicker blubber layers, and more coordinated behaviors. Predators, in turn, refined methods capable of overcoming those emerging defenses. For a period, the balance favored confrontation. The ocean supported enough productivity below to sustain repeated losses at this scale. Whale populations could absorb predation without immediate collapse because reproduction and growth kept pace with mortality. In this equilibrium, the relationship between predator and whale resembled the dynamics of terrestrial systems, where large herbivores graze in open landscapes under the watch of formidable carnivores. The presence of risk did not eliminate abundance, it structured it. This inversion of modern hierarchy did not signal weakness in whales. It reflected the particular arrangement of energy and opportunity within the Miocene Sea. Whales were neither fragile nor secondary. They were abundant enough to sustain another layer above them. In that layered abundance, the ocean briefly allowed a configuration in which giants fed upon giants, each embedded within a system broad enough to contain the exchange. Mass in the ocean carries a constant demand. Every meter of length, every layer of muscle must be sustained by reliable intake. Large predators cannot drift between long stretches of emptiness. Their metabolism requires repeated reward. A missed pursuit is not merely inconvenience, but deficit, and repeated deficits accumulate quickly in bodies that burn energy at scale. In marine systems, size is tolerated only when supply rises to meet it. For a hunter built to challenge other giants, the margin for failure narrows further. Acceleration through dense water consumes energy rapidly. Collisions carry risk of injury. Even a fractured tooth or strained muscle can impair survival in an animal whose strategy depends on force. Such a design persists only when the probability of success outweighs those costs. Evolution does not maintain extravagance without compensation. In the Miocene Sea, encounters must have been frequent enough to offset that risk. Prey animals of substantial size moved along predictable corridors, gathering in seasonal concentrations. Juveniles represented vulnerable stages in life cycles that repeated with dependable rhythm. Adult whales, though formidable, were not beyond reach when conditions aligned. For a predator specialized in confrontation, opportunity was not an exception, but part of the background. The persistence of such a hunter across generations suggests that failure did not dominate its experience. Natural selection refines lineages through survival and reproduction. If scarcity had defined its world, the lineage would have contracted or shifted toward more generalized feeding. Instead, anatomy intensified around strength and durability. That reinforcement indicates that hunts yielded sufficient return, often enough to sustain growth, maturation, and offspring. Violence at this level can exist only within a system buffered by abundance. When lower tiers produce steadily, they absorb loss without cascading collapse. If a whale population declines sharply, recovery depends on reproduction supported by continued productivity below. The Miocene Ocean appears to have held enough surplus to withstand the removal of large individuals while maintaining the base that nourished both predator and prey. The food web did not unravel under pressure. It redistributed energy within its tiers. Such resilience is not limitless. It depends on circulation patterns, nutrient supply, and climate remaining within tolerable bounds. During this interval, those factors aligned in a configuration that permitted intensity without immediate instability. Predators could risk high energy pursuits because the system replenished itself with consistency. In that context, violence did not represent breakdown but expression. The ocean carried sufficient reserves to sustain confrontation among its largest inhabitants, allowing an ecological arrangement that later seas no longer supported. Not all apex hunters share the same strategy. In modern seas, some of the most formidable predators succeed through coordination rather than individual dominance. Groups move with deliberate timing, surrounding prey, exhausting it, dividing effort and reward. Such cooperation does not emerge from ease. It develops where competition is intense and resources must be secured efficiently. Social bonds become tools shaped by environmental constraints. Yet the Miocene hunter we have traced through stone appears to have followed a different path. Its anatomy emphasizes power concentrated within a single body. The thickness of the skull, the reinforcement of the jaw, the distribution of teeth across both upper and lower arches all suggest reliance on solitary force rather than orchestrated teamwork. Where modern orcas distribute risk among pod members, this predator carried risk within its own mass. Cooperation evolves when individual attempts frequently fall short. In ecosystems where prey evade capture through agility, intelligence, or sheer size, predators benefit from synchronized action. Communication refines tactics. Shared learning improves success rates. This dynamic reflects competition not only between predator and prey, but among predators themselves. Under such pressure, collaboration becomes adaptive. The Miocene seas, by contrast, seem to have offered different incentives. Evidence points toward a landscape of abundant large prey and comparatively low apex competition within certain regions. When energy accumulates steadily and prey density remains high, the urgency to share diminishes. A sufficiently large and well-adapted predator can rely on its own capabilities without needing coordinated allies. Success does not depend on numbers, but on direct strength. Force, in this context, was not an act of excess, but a practical solution. A massive body with reinforced jaws could intercept and disable prey independently. The cost of hunting alone was offset by reliable encounters. Without relentless rivalry at the highest tier, the ecological space allowed a singular strategy to thrive. Specialization sharpened around crushing power rather than social complexity. This does not imply simplicity of behavior. Even solitary predators exhibit nuanced movement patterns and environmental awareness. However, the structure of the system did not require cooperative scaffolding to sustain them. Energy flowed upward with enough consistency that one large hunter could secure its needs without constant partnership. Over time, as circulation patterns shifted and productivity narrowed, the advantage of such solitary excess would diminish. But during the interval we observe, the sea imposed fewer immediate restraints. It permitted a design built on strength alone. In that temporary configuration, the ocean reduced the necessity for collaboration at the top of the food web, allowing force to stand unshared and sufficient within a single frame. Fossil layers from the Miocene do not preserve a solitary ruler, but an assembly. Within the same sediments that hold the remains of giant predatory whales lie teeth from immense sharks, vertebrae from large baleen species, and fragments of other marine mammals that reached formidable size. The record suggests overlap, not succession. These animals moved through the same waters, drawing from the same expansive web of life. Among them were sharks of extraordinary length and mass, equipped with serrated teeth designed to slice through thick blubber and bone. Their presence alone signals a high ceiling of available energy. Alongside them traveled broad mouthed filter feeders, sweeping dense swarms of prey from productive corridors. Between these extremes swam toothed whales of varying proportions, some hunting fish, others targeting mammals. The structure of the ecosystem supported more than a single apex strategy. Such coexistence demands a foundation capable of sustaining parallel demands. When several large predators inhabit the same basin, competition intensifies unless productivity rises in proportion. Prey populations must replenish quickly enough to supply multiple hunters, each removing substantial biomass. If production falters, dominant forms are forced into decline, and the hierarchy contracts until equilibrium returns at a lower level. Yet, during this interval, contraction did not immediately follow expansion. Energy flowed upward through numerous channels at once. Baleen whales converted dense prey into enormous bodies. Predatory sharks intercepted marine mammals. Giant odontocetes challenged prey within their own weight class. Rather than collapsing under the strain of these towering trophic levels, the system widened beneath them. Base productivity and mid-level communities scaled in tandem with those at the top, maintaining resilience across tiers. This upward expansion did not imply uniform conditions everywhere, but across significant regions the pattern held. Seasonal surges in nutrient supply, stable migratory routes, and enduring reproductive grounds created a matrix within which multiple giants could overlap without driving one another swiftly to extinction. Diversity at the highest levels became a feature rather than an anomaly. Ecological peaks are defined not only by the size of their largest inhabitants, but by the breadth of their pyramids. During the Miocene, the marine pyramid appears unusually tall and broad simultaneously. Large sharks and whales shared space in ways that later oceans rarely replicate. Each apex presence reflects a system operating near the upper limits of what its circulation and climate could maintain. Over time, adjustments in those underlying forces would tighten the structure, and such crowded summits would give way to narrower arrangements. For a span of geological time, however, the sea permitted an architecture in which giants were not isolated exceptions, but neighbors within a densely layered world. Change does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it begins as a subtle alteration in temperature, a gradual redistribution of heat that reshapes circulation without spectacle. In the later Miocene, global averages declined incrementally. Polar regions accumulated ice with increasing permanence, reflecting more sunlight back into space and reinforcing the cooling. The shift was measured not in sudden collapse, but in accumulation, year layered upon year. As ice sheets expanded, pressure gradients adjusted. Ocean currents that once moved along certain predictable paths encountered new barriers or redirected flows. The geometry of circulation altered in response to cooling poles and reorganized wind systems. Where nutrient-rich waters had risen steadily before, the timing and intensity of that ascent began to fluctuate. Some regions remained productive, yet others experienced longer intervals of relative scarcity. Nutrient delivery depends on vertical mixing and the steady upwelling of deep water. When surface layers cool unevenly or stabilize differently, stratification patterns change. In certain basins, warmer upper waters lingered above colder depths, inhibiting exchange. Elsewhere, stronger winds intensified mixing temporarily, only to retreat with seasonal variability. The broad coherence that once characterized productivity became more patchwork in distribution. Such adjustments ripple upward through the marine web. Phytoplankton blooms respond quickly to shifts in light and nutrient availability. If pulses become irregular, the organisms that rely on them must adapt to shorter surges and longer gaps. Zooplankton populations fluctuate in turn. Fish recruitment varies from year to year. Larger animals sense these changes not as isolated events, but as altered patterns that reshape migration and breeding timing. No singular catastrophe marked this transition. There was no single horizon of extinction written sharply across the fossil record at once. Instead, persistent pressure accumulated. Slight declines in average productivity over extended intervals place strain on species whose existence depends on surplus. Large predators, refined for environments of reliability, find their margins narrowed when predictability erodes. Cooling also influenced coastlines, altering sea levels and modifying shallow habitats. Shelf areas that once supported dense communities contracted or shifted, redistributing prey fields. As continental configurations continued their slow movement, gateways between ocean basins opened or constricted, redirecting major currents and reshaping global circulation. Taken individually, each adjustment might seem modest. In combination, they altered the architecture that had allowed a crowded summit of giants. Energy continued to flow, yet less evenly and with reduced redundancy. The system did not collapse at once, it tightened. Within that tightening, the highest tiers would face the earliest consequences, not through sudden disappearance, but through gradual erosion of the conditions that once sustained their scale. At the summit of any ecosystem, life balances on a narrow margin. Apex predators occupy positions sustained not merely by access to prey, but by the surplus that flows beneath them. Their bodies represent accumulated abundance. When that abundance contracts, even slightly, the highest tier feels the strain before lower levels register the shift. Large predators consume substantial energy to maintain movement, thermoregulation, growth, and reproduction. Their reproductive cycles are often extended, with fewer offspring and longer maturation periods. Stability favors them because predictable supply offsets the cost of scale. When variability increases, even modestly, their strategies become vulnerable. A sequence of lean seasons does not need to be catastrophic to erode their presence. It needs only to be persistent. As productivity patterns in the late Miocene became less uniform, apex hunters encountered increasing irregularity. Prey populations that once concentrated along dependable corridors shifted unpredictably. Migration timing loosened from its former precision. Calving grounds altered with changing coastlines and temperature gradients. None of these adjustments represented immediate collapse, yet together they reduced the reliability upon which large, solitary hunters depended. Whales, though targeted earlier in the chain, occupied a broader ecological base. Many species feed at lower trophic levels, converting plankton and small schooling fish directly into biomass. Their adaptive flexibility, combined with larger population sizes and varied feeding strategies, provided resilience against moderate fluctuation. Some species adjusted migratory routes, others diversified prey. Their survival was not tied to a single narrow strategy. The specialized predator that had flourished during peak abundance faced a different calculation. Its anatomy, refined for confronting large prey, offered limited room for dietary shift. If encounters declined in frequency or distribution, its energetic equation faltered. Natural selection does not preserve forms that no longer match prevailing conditions. Gradual attrition replaces dominance with absence. In the fossil record, the disappearance of such apex forms often precedes broader turnover. Their vanishing serves as a quiet indication that underlying systems have begun to reconfigure. They do not fail because of intrinsic weakness, but because they occupy the most exposed position when energy flow tightens. Like the highest stones in a carefully balanced arch, they are the first to fall when pressure redistributes. The absence of this predator from younger strata suggests that the ocean had already altered its trajectory before more conspicuous changes unfolded. The direction of circulation, climate, and nutrient supply was shifting toward a configuration that favored efficiency over excess. Long before whales consolidated their dominance in later seas, the specialized hunter had faded, marking the moment when the summit narrowed and the system recalibrated toward a leaner equilibrium. In the long history of life, absence is rarely permanent. When a dominant form disappears, the space it occupies tends to invite experimentation. Lineages diversify, traits reassemble in new combinations, and ecological roles are often reclaimed by different bodies shaped by similar pressures. The fossil record contains many examples of such replacement, where extinction clears ground that evolution soon repopulates. Yet in the strata that follow the disappearance of this formidable predator, there is a quiet gap. Later oceans produced large whales, swift hunters, cooperative strategists, and immense filter feeders. They did not, however, produce another marine mammal equipped with reinforced jaws and thickened teeth, designed explicitly for crushing the skeletons of other giants. The blueprint fades without an evident successor. This absence is not due to anatomical limitation. Marine mammals retained the capacity for size and intelligence. Some lineages grew even larger than those of the Miocene. Others developed complex social behavior and refined sensory systems. The potential for innovation remained. What changed was not the toolkit of evolution, but the environmental equation that once made a particular design advantageous. Niches persist only when the underlying flow of energy sustains them. If productivity tightens and prey availability shifts, the benefit of extreme specialization diminishes. A predator optimized for confronting large, energy-rich targets depends on a steady foundation of surplus below. Without that reliable surplus, natural selection favors flexibility over force. In leaner systems, adaptability becomes safer than commitment to a narrow strategy. Across millions of years following the Miocene peak, no lineage retraced the path toward a bilateral array of bone-crushing teeth at comparable scale. Whales diversified along other trajectories, refining filter mechanisms, enhancing endurance, or evolving coordinated hunting tactics. The evolutionary landscape did not prohibit experimentation, it simply did not reward that particular architecture again. The lack of replacement reveals more than the extinction itself. It indicates that the ecological window which once supported such intensity had closed. Conditions no longer aligned to make that design sustainable. Circulation patterns, climate gradients, and prey distributions shifted toward configurations that favored moderation. The opportunity that once allowed giants to challenge one another directly dissolved within broader changes in ocean structure. Evolution does not preserve memory. It responds to present conditions. When those conditions no longer favor a trait, even a successful one, repetition becomes unlikely. The fossil record's silence after this predator's disappearance serves as testimony to a transition deeper than species loss. It marks the withdrawal of a set of environmental parameters that had briefly permitted an apex built on crushing force, parameters that subsequent oceans never restored. Over time, the architecture of the sea settled into a different proportion. The tall, crowded summit of giants eased into a narrower profile. Energy still flowed from the sunlit surface to darkened depth, yet its ascent no longer built the same towering tiers. Productivity became more uneven, and resilience depended increasingly on efficiency rather than excess. In this revised arrangement, feeding strategies shifted. Baleen whales expanded into forms that could process enormous volumes of small prey, converting dense swarms into sustained mass without relying on the risk of direct confrontation. Their mouths evolved into sieves, their throats pleaded for expansion, their migrations synchronized with seasonal blooms. Instead of contesting other giants, they harvested abundance at lower trophic levels, anchoring themselves directly to the base. Toothed whales diversified as well, but their strategies emphasized speed, echolocation, precision, and in some cases, cooperative hunting. Social structures tightened. Pods moved with coordinated patterns, sharing information about prey distribution and ocean conditions. Intelligence became an asset, not for overpowering other large mammals, but for navigating a landscape where rewards were more diffuse and competition more frequent. At the same time, some shark lineages declined in size or shifted ecological roles. Apex positions did not vanish entirely, yet they occupied a reduced space within the broader web. No longer did multiple extreme predators share overlapping territories at comparable scale. The system, recalibrated by climate and circulation, favored stability achieved through moderation. Energy narrowing does not imply impoverishment, but constraint. When nutrient delivery fluctuates and base productivity stabilizes at lower averages, the surplus available for elaborate specialization diminishes. Evolution responds by favoring designs that extract consistent returns from widespread resources. Filter feeding, cooperative hunting, and migration tuned to seasonal peaks become reliable solutions within these limits. As these strategies consolidated, the ecological ceiling lowered. The maximum viable scale for confrontation-based dominance decreased because the environment no longer buffered its cost. The sea continued to support impressive organisms, some larger in absolute size than their predecessors, yet the structure of their interactions changed. Giants persisted, but they derived their mass from efficient exploitation of small prey rather than direct rivalry with equals. This gradual transition redefined possibility. The range of viable forms narrowed toward those compatible with steadier, leaner flows of energy. What once allowed multiple apex competitors to thrive contracted into a configuration where collaboration and filtration achieved greater success than solitary force. The ocean did not empty, nor did it lose complexity, but the vertical expanse of its food web shortened. Within that shortened profile, the designs favored by evolution reflected the quiet recalibration of a system that no longer sustained its earlier extremes. In many chapters of natural history, decline is followed by renewal. Forests return after fire, coral reefs rebuild after a storm. Extinction events clear ecological space that later lineages occupy in altered but recognizable form. The language of recovery suggests a cycle, a system bending under pressure and then restoring what was lost. The transformation that reshaped the Miocene seas does not fit that pattern. There was no subsequent reemergence of the same towering configuration of abundance and confrontation. The large solitary predator faded. The crowded summit of overlapping giants thinned. Over time, new balances formed, but they did not recreate the previous architecture. The structure itself had shifted. Climate trajectories continued along new gradients. Polar ice persisted to a greater extent than before. Circulation reorganized around altered temperature contrasts and continental gateways. These deeper controls govern productivity more decisively than any single lineage can. When they changed, they redrew the energetic map upon which all marine life depends. Restoration to earlier parameters would have required a reversal of planetary scale forces that did not return to their former arrangement. The absence of repetition suggests that some ecological states are contingent, dependent on a narrow overlap of factors unlikely to align again in identical fashion. The Miocene peak arose from a specific configuration of warmth, circulation, nutrient flux, and geography. When that configuration dissolved, it did not leave behind a template waiting to be reactivated. Instead, subsequent oceans organized themselves around different constraints and opportunities. Evolution is opportunistic, not restorative. It does not strive to reassemble vanished designs unless conditions favor their revival. In leaner systems, traits that maximize efficiency and flexibility are selected over those that depend on sustained surplus. Large filter feeders, migratory specialists, and cooperative hunters flourished within the revised framework. None required the exceptional margins that earlier seas had permitted. To describe this transition as a failure to recover implies that the former state was normative or ideal. In reality, it was one expression among many possible arrangements of life under shifting planetary conditions. Once the underlying drivers moved beyond the thresholds that sustained it, the system stabilized along a new trajectory. That stabilization carried its own coherence and resilience, even as it excluded previous extremes. Earth's history reveals numerous such experiments. Periods of expansion give way to contraction, complex webs simplify, and later diversify in alternate forms. The disappearance of the Miocene apex, built on crushing force, marks not a temporary deviation, but a redefinition. The ocean did not rebuild the past because the past depended on circumstances that no longer existed. Instead, it consolidated a different equilibrium, demonstrating that ecological possibility narrows and widens in response to forces far deeper than any single lineage. Stand at the edge of a modern coastline, and the surface often appears composed, waves rising and falling with measured rhythm, seabirds tracing steady arcs overhead. Even far offshore, the dominant impression is vastness rather than tension. Beneath that surface, food webs remain intricate, migrations unfold across basins, and predators still patrol the depths, yet the structure supporting them differs from the layered intensity of earlier epochs. The upper tiers today host fewer species that operate at extreme size and solitary dominance. Some sharks remain formidable, and certain toothed whales maintain apex roles, but the overlap of multiple colossal hunters sharing the same ecological space is uncommon. Many marine systems display a more streamlined hierarchy, with clearer separation between trophic levels and fewer instances of direct confrontation among giants. Food webs have also narrowed in breadth at their peaks. Productivity continues, yet its distribution is uneven, concentrated in particular regions such as productive upwelling zones and polar fronts. In large stretches of open ocean, nutrient levels remain comparatively low. Species that endure these conditions often rely on efficiency, migration, or cooperation to secure sustenance. The energy available at the highest tiers is sufficient for survival, though rarely abundant enough to encourage extravagant specialization. Tolerance for extremes has diminished alongside this narrowing. When productivity fluctuates, modern systems may respond quickly, sometimes with cascading impacts. Apex predators are especially sensitive to sustained decline in prey, abundance, or habitat quality. Their presence persists, but at densities and diversities that reflect constrained margins rather than expansive surplus. This quieter arrangement can create an impression of stability. Vast expanses of water appear undisturbed by visible conflict. Many dominant marine mammals feed on small organisms, shaping their immense bodies through filtration rather than direct rivalry. Cooperative hunting, when it occurs, often targets prey far smaller than the hunters themselves. The visible signs of large-scale predation are less frequent than they once were. Calm, in this context, reflects a system adjusted to tighter boundaries. Complexity remains, but it operates within narrower energetic corridors. The sea continues to support remarkable life, though the vertical reach of its food web does not rise as high as during earlier peaks of abundance. Fewer extreme strategies coexist simultaneously, and the ceiling that once permitted confrontation among giants has settled lower. Such composure does not equate automatically with thriving health. Constraint can produce order just as readily as prosperity. Modern oceans function within the climatic and circulation patterns that define this era, sustaining countless species through adaptation to present limits. Beneath the apparent tranquility lies a structure shaped by long-term shifts in productivity, one that favors moderation over the towering intensity of past seas. A fossil is often imagined as the remnant of an individual life, a fragment of bone or enamel fixed in stone. Yet, when examined within its broader context, it carries information far beyond anatomy. It preserves traces of the energetic landscape that once supported the organism: the thickness of a jaw, the scale of a vertebra, the density of enamel. Each detail encodes the conditions that allowed such structures to form. Body size does not arise in isolation. To sustain great mass requires a steady throughput of energy from primary producers to the uppermost tiers of the food web. Large predators, or immense filter feeders, represent accumulated productivity, stored briefly in muscle and bone. When the base of the system produces abundantly and consistently, size becomes feasible. When that base constricts, the maximum attainable scale declines accordingly. Teeth offer further insight. Their shape, wear, and arrangement reveal the type of prey commonly encountered. Broad, reinforced crowns imply repeated contact with resistant material. Slender, piercing forms suggest softer targets. In marine environments, where fluid dynamics soften impact and buoyancy alters force, the development of crushing structures signals not only dietary preference, but repeated access to prey capable of justifying such specialization. The design reflects habitual interaction within a particular energetic framework. Absence holds equal significance. When a lineage characterized by extreme morphology disappears and is not replaced, the void points to a contraction of possibility. The conditions that once sustained that form no longer align. The fossil record, in its gaps and discontinuities, traces the ebb and flow of environmental capacity. It shows where ceilings once rose and where they later descended. Seen in this way, the remains of a large Miocene predator do not simply attest to its existence. They record a moment when nutrient circulation, climate gradients, and prey abundance converged to support an apex built on force. The proportions of its skull indicate the magnitude of muscles it carried. The durability of its teeth implies the density of its prey's bones. Each feature embodies a network of relationships extending downward through the entire marine system. Such fossils function as environmental snapshots. They capture the configuration of energy flow at a particular interval, preserved through mineralization and time. By comparing them with later assemblages, one can trace how the system narrowed or shifted. The story they tell is not limited to individual adaptation, it encompasses the architecture of the ocean itself. In studying these remnants, attention turns from the drama of predation to the quiet mathematics of supply and demand. Bone and enamel become indicators of abundance, distribution, and constraint. The creature etched in stone serves as a record of an era when the sea's energetic ledger permitted a form that subsequent conditions would not replicate. When people picture distant oceans, they often imagine something unfinished, a primordial expanse waiting to become what it is now. The word ancient carries an undertone of simplicity, as though time itself guarantees progress toward greater refinement. Yet the marine worlds of deep history were not drafts. They were complete systems, shaped by conditions that sometimes exceeded the intricacy of what exists today. The Miocene seas, along with other productive intervals, supported layered food webs that rose high and spread wide. Multiple large predators overlapped. Diverse whale lineages occupied varied ecological roles. Sharks of immense scale navigated productive corridors. Beneath them, schooling fish, cephalopods, and invertebrates responded to steady nutrient flux in patterns that reinforced one another. This arrangement did not represent a crude stage before modern order. It expressed an alternate structure assembled under different climatic and geographic circumstances. Modern oceans remain astonishingly active. Coral reefs teem with species. Polar fronts surge with seasonal abundance. Coastal upwelling regions host dense communities that rival many ancient settings in productivity. Yet across much of the open sea, trophic layers are comparatively streamlined. Apex diversity is lower, and certain extremes no longer coexist within the same basin. Specialization persists, but within narrower energetic margins. The contrast lies not in vitality but in configuration. Ancient intervals of exceptional circulation and nutrient distribution permitted complexity to accumulate upward without immediate constraint. When those intervals ended, the resulting systems reorganized around efficiency. Some branches expanded, while others contracted. The total number of organisms may remain vast, yet the vertical reach of interaction can shorten. Human memory, limited to brief historical windows, struggles with such scale. Over centuries, oceans appear constant enough that long-term contraction or expansion of possibility fades from view. A whale glimpsed today suggests continuity with all whales past. A shark crossing modern waters seems archetypal. Without the perspective of sediment layers and fossil assemblages, it is easy to assume that what surrounds us represents culmination. In reality, ecological architectures shift across millions of years. Complexity can diminish in certain dimensions while increasing in others. The disappearance of overlapping apex giants does not signal decline in all aspects, but it does reflect narrowing in particular forms of interaction. Our sense of progress confuses change with advancement. Ancient seas were not primitive rehearsals. They were expressions of planetary conditions that briefly allowed abundance to stack higher and conflict to intensify without immediate destabilization. Modern oceans reflect another chapter, equally coherent yet differently proportioned. To understand this requires stretching perspective beyond familiar horizons and accepting that richness is not linear through time. Beneath shifting winds and drifting continents, the ocean acts not merely as a setting for life, but as a shaping force. Temperature gradients, salinity contrasts, and circulation patterns define the boundaries within which organisms must operate. Life does not impose itself upon this framework, it adjusts to it. Each adaptation, each expansion in size or behavior, reflects an accommodation to conditions already in place. When nutrient cycles intensify and currents distribute abundance broadly, opportunity expands. New strategies emerge. Bodies lengthen, teeth thicken, migrations extend. The sea, through its physics and chemistry, permits these designs by maintaining the energetic flow required to sustain them. In such intervals, complexity stacks upward. The architecture of the food web rises toward forms that seem extraordinary only when viewed from later, narrower times. Yet the same forces that enable also constrain. As climate shifts and circulation reorganizes, the parameters of possibility tighten, productive corridors contract or relocate. Thermal boundaries redefine habitats. The ocean does not deliberate, yet its adjustments function as decisions at planetary scale. It opens a window and later closes it, not in reaction to any single species, but as part of its own evolving equilibrium. Creatures, even the most imposing, exist within this larger design. They are responses to a particular arrangement of light, nutrients, and space. Their specialized features embody a set of environmental permissions. When those permissions change, the organisms that depended upon them may persist, adapt, or fade. The continuity lies not in individual lineages, but in the ongoing recalibration of conditions that shape them. The Miocene predator, refined for crushing bone, stands as one such response. Its mass, dentition, and solitary strategy reflect a moment when surplus energy flowed through stable corridors. That configuration allowed strength to concentrate without immediate penalty. The form did not arise in isolation. It crystallized from the ocean's broader organization. As cooling altered circulation and productivity redistributed, the underlying template shifted. The sea no longer maintained the same margin for extreme confrontation among giants. Over time, designs more aligned with efficiency and cooperation found firmer footing. The previous blueprint, encoded in enamel and bone, ceased to receive reinforcement from the environment. In this sense, the predator was never the architect. It was the structure erected within a set of temporary constraints. The true builder was the ocean itself, arranging currents, modulating climate, channeling nutrients in patterns that made certain solutions viable. When those patterns changed, the form was withdrawn from active construction. Life continues to assemble new responses as conditions evolve. Some resemble earlier experiments, others diverge entirely. The ocean remains the unseen planner, shaping possibility through forces that operate far below conscious intent. It is tempting to imagine life as a steady ascent, each era surpassing the last in scale, intelligence, or power. Massive bodies seem to imply superiority. Dramatic predation suggests dominance. Yet the history recorded in sediment and stone does not trace a simple upward line. It reveals oscillation, expansion, and contraction, experimentation followed by restraint. Greater size carries advantages, yet it also amplifies vulnerability. Large organisms require abundant and predictable resources. They mature slowly and reproduce at lower rates. When environments fluctuate, their margins narrow quickly. What appears impressive in one interval can become impractical in another. Magnitude is not a final destination, it is a conditional outcome. Similarly, intense predatory strategies do not secure permanence. A lineage refined for force may flourish when prey is plentiful and competition manageable. If those conditions shift, the same specialization can become a liability. Evolution does not reward drama for its own sake. It favors alignment with prevailing circumstances, even if that alignment produces forms less conspicuous than those that preceded them. Over geological time, extremes tend to be trimmed. This trimming does not occur through deliberate correction, but through shifting balances of supply and demand. When energy surges through a system, taller trophic structures emerge. When that surge subsides or redistributes, the highest tiers contract first. The process resembles pruning rather than collapse, reducing forms that exceed the capacity of the environment to sustain them. Stability often favors moderation. Designs that draw from broad resources, adapt to variable conditions, and avoid excessive energetic commitment can persist across longer spans. They may not dominate in spectacle, yet they endure. Many modern marine mammals embody such moderation, combining substantial size with feeding strategies anchored lower in the food web or enhanced by cooperation. Excess invites risk because it depends on sustained surplus. Surplus itself is rarely permanent. Climate fluctuates, currents shift, continents move. When the background parameters recalibrate, forms constructed during periods of abundance encounter new limits. Some adjust, others fade, and the overall architecture reorganizes around what can be maintained consistently. The disappearance of the Miocene predator, built on crushing force, illustrates this dynamic. Its form represented a peak achieved under favorable conditions. As those conditions altered, the evolutionary ledger favored different investments. The narrative is not one of failure, but of recalibration. Life does not progress toward ever-increasing magnitude or intensity. It responds to changing boundaries, sometimes expanding into dramatic configurations, sometimes consolidating into leaner arrangements. The arc of marine history demonstrates that endurance often resides not at the far edge of possibility, but within designs balanced against variability. Extremes can illuminate what is achievable. They do not guarantee what will last. Climate is often reduced to numbers, degrees rising or falling across charts and maps. Yet in the ocean, temperature is only the visible edge of a deeper transformation. When global conditions shift, circulation patterns adjust, wind belts reorganize, and the exchange between surface and depth alters in subtle ways. These adjustments ripple through nutrient pathways, reshaping the flow that determines which forms of life can persist. A slight cooling can expand polar ice, increasing reflectivity and reinforcing atmospheric gradients. A period of warming can intensify stratification in certain regions, limiting vertical mixing. In both cases, the most significant consequence lies not in the number itself, but in how it rearranges supply lines. Nutrients may rise more weakly or concentrate in narrower bands. Productive zones migrate. Entire marine provinces redefine their boundaries. As these changes accumulate, ecological ceilings rise or fall without spectacle. Species adapted to surplus may find that the foundation beneath them no longer delivers with former consistency. Others, suited to variable or lean conditions, expand their range. The shift unfolds across generations, often without abrupt extinction horizons. A lineage may decline gradually, leaving behind fewer fossils, fewer descendants, until it disappears from the record altogether. Apex predators are especially sensitive to these quiet recalibrations. Their size and specialization depend on steady energy transfer through multiple trophic levels. When variability increases or total productivity moderates, their margin narrows. They do not always vanish with dramatic die-offs. More often, their numbers thin until reproduction can no longer offset losses. In time, absence replaces presence without fanfare. Lower tiers may remain vibrant. Filter feeders can thrive if small prey persist, even when the uppermost layer contracts. Cooperative hunters may adapt to more dispersed resources. The system does not necessarily collapse, but it simplifies. The web shortens. Interactions that once defined an era give way to configurations more compatible with prevailing constraints. Climate change, viewed across geological spans, therefore alters the menu of viable designs. It governs how much energy ascends from microscopic producers to the largest consumers. When circulation patterns favor broad and sustained productivity, extreme forms can take hold. When those patterns tighten or redistribute, the range of feasible strategies contracts accordingly. The transformation is rarely theatrical. Oceans adjust over thousands or millions of years, layering new equilibria atop fading ones. What disappears may do so quietly, recorded only in the diminishing frequency of bones within sediment. The surface continues to move, waves rise and fall, yet beneath them the architecture of possibility recalibrates. Temperature marks the beginning of the story, but the true alteration lies in the reshaping of limits that define what the sea can sustain. In the present day, satellite measurements trace subtle variations in ocean color, revealing fluctuations in phytoplankton concentration across vast expanses. Instruments drift beneath the surface, recording temperature gradients and shifts in salinity. These observations indicate that the sea is once again adjusting. Circulation patterns respond to warming trends. Polar ice retreats in some regions, and stratification strengthens in others. The changes unfold gradually, layered across decades rather than millennia, yet they carry implications that echo through deeper time. Productivity does not respond uniformly. Certain high latitude zones have experienced seasonal increases in biological activity as melting ice exposes more open water to sunlight. Elsewhere, intensified stratification restricts nutrient mixing, limiting the ascent of essential elements from depth. Coastal regions fluctuate in response to altered wind regimes and runoff patterns. The resulting mosaic resembles earlier transitions recorded in sediment, where redistribution rather than outright collapse marked the turning point. As productivity patterns shift, trophic structures recalibrate. Species that depend on consistent prey concentrations may find their ranges altered. Migration timing adjusts in response to bloom cycles that no longer align perfectly with ancestral cues. Some populations adapt through flexibility, others decline as their energetic margins narrow. The highest tiers remain the most sensitive because their survival depends on the reliable transfer of energy from multiple layers below. The fossil record illustrates a recurring theme. When underlying circulation changes persist, apex predators are among the first to retreat. Their disappearance does not announce itself with dramatic spectacle. Instead, it appears as a thinning in abundance, a contraction of range, a quiet absence in subsequent layers of sediment. What follows is not necessarily total impoverishment, but simplification. Looking backward does not offer precise forecasts for the present. Planetary conditions never repeat in identical form. Continents occupy new configurations, atmospheric composition differs, and human influence introduces additional variables. Yet patterns in deep time reveal consistent responses to altered energy flow. When ceilings descend, extreme strategies diminish. When surplus constricts, moderation prevails. The significance of this ancient predator lies, therefore, not only in its former dominance, but in the sequence that followed its decline. It marks the threshold beyond which certain possibilities are narrowed. Today's oceans are again negotiating their energetic boundaries. Observations of shifting productivity, warming currents, and changing ice cover reflect an ongoing recalibration. History does not dictate a single outcome, but it clarifies sensitivity. It shows which layers of the food web are most exposed to sustained alteration. The sea has reorganized before under persistent climatic pressure. In understanding that process, modern changes appear not as isolated anomalies, but as part of a continuum in which the architecture of possibility continually adjusts to shifting planetary forces. There is a certain reassurance in imagining the ocean as diminished in its extremes. The absence of colossal predators challenging one another in open water lends a sense of restraint. The surface appears vast yet ordered, migrations patterned, interactions moderated. Compared to an era when multiple apex giants overlapped in the same basins, the modern arrangement feels measured. That sense of safety, however, arises within boundaries shaped by contraction. When the energetic ceiling lowers, certain forms of confrontation become untenable. The disappearance of solitary hunters built for crushing force was not replaced by equally formidable analogs. The narrowing of possibility reduced not only intensity, but also the range of interactions that once defined marine ecosystems at their peak. Reduced violence is often interpreted as progress, yet, in ecological terms, it can signal constraint. A system capable of sustaining extreme predation without destabilizing lower tiers must possess robust productivity and redundancy. When that redundancy fades, moderation prevails by necessity. Strategies that once thrived under surplus become impractical, and the resulting quiet reflects limits rather than inherent gentleness. Modern oceans still host powerful predators and dramatic hunts. Orcas coordinate with precision. Sharks patrol productive corridors. Tuna slice through schools of fish. These dynamics are significant and complex. What differs is the breadth of overlapping extremes. The sea no longer supports the same density of apex forms competing at comparable scale within the same regions. Its upper tiers are more compartmentalized. Calm can therefore conceal absence. A streamlined food web functions efficiently, but it offers fewer avenues for extraordinary expansion. Where earlier oceans allowed multiple towering strategies to coexist, contemporary systems balance closer to their energetic threshold. Stability under constraint appears tranquil, even though it emerges from narrower margins. This is not to suggest that modern seas lack richness or vitality. They remain intricate, adaptive, and responsive to ongoing climatic forces. Countless species interact across diverse habitats, from coral reefs to abyssal plains. Yet the specific configuration that once permitted giants to confront one another directly, supported by sustained surplus, has receded. In that recession lies a reminder that reduction can masquerade as refinement. A smaller ocean, in terms of vertical complexity at its summit, may seem easier to inhabit imaginatively. The absence of overwhelming extremes lends familiarity. Beneath that familiarity, however, resides the quiet acknowledgement that certain capabilities have withdrawn. The present configuration represents one stable solution among many, shaped by planetary shifts that lowered the ceiling without draining the sea of life. Across the younger layers of marine sediment, the pattern changes. Teeth diminish in thickness. Jaw fragments no longer suggest the same reinforced architecture. The record continues, populated by whales, sharks, fish, and countless invertebrates, yet the specific signature of direct confrontation between giants fades. What remains is not a dramatic boundary, but an absence that settles quietly through time. In many ecosystems, when a dominant form disappears, something rises to occupy its place. Here, there is no such succession. Later seas produced hunters of remarkable coordination and intelligence, predators capable of targeting sizable prey through collective effort. They did not recreate the solitary force embodied by the earlier predator. The ecological niche, defined by the bone crushing scale, did not reopen. The absence persists across millions of years of sediment. Stratigraphic sequences preserve other fluctuations, warming intervals and cooling phases, expansions and contractions of reef systems and pelagic communities. Nowhere within that span does the same configuration of predatory anatomy return at comparable magnitude. The silence grows more pronounced with each successive layer. Violence at that level, dependent on sustained surplus and predictable concentration of large prey, appears to have been bound to a narrow window of planetary conditions. Once those conditions shifted, the system reorganized around different balances. Intense confrontation among giants gave way to strategies emphasizing efficiency, cooperation, and migration tuned to fluctuating productivity. The upper tier adjusted rather than restored its previous form. Silence in the fossil record is not merely emptiness, it is evidence. The continued absence of reinforced jaws and massive bilateral dentition indicates that the environmental parameters that once rewarded such design did not realign. The ocean retained power and complexity, yet it no longer supported that particular expression of intensity. This forgetting was not deliberate. It unfolded as currents redirected, nutrient pathways altered, and climate gradients stabilized along new trajectories. Within those revised constraints, extreme predation ceased to be sustainable. Over time, what had been a prominent feature of marine interaction receded into mineral memory. Fossils endure where living bodies do not. The heavy teeth entombed in ancient rock stand as reminders of a capacity the ocean once allowed. Around them, younger sediments accumulate without echo. The gap between past and present becomes its own form of testimony. In this quiet, the narrative of the sea acquires depth. It demonstrates that certain heights of interaction are contingent, sustained only while underlying forces align. When those alignments dissolve, the structures built upon them withdraw. The ocean continues, vibrant and immense, yet the specific intensity it once hosted exists now only in stone, a memory preserved without repetition. Some fossils do more than record a species. They define a threshold. The remains of the great Miocene predator stand at such a boundary, marking the furthest extent to which marine systems once sustained direct confrontation among giants. Its reinforced skull and crushing dentition represent not simply adaptation, but a measurement of how much surplus energy the ocean could briefly channel to its highest tiers. At that elevation of complexity, the system balanced on abundant circulation, stable climates, and reliable prey distributions. The food web extended upward without immediate collapse, supporting more than one apex strategy at exceptional scale. Yet this configuration existed within narrow margins. When underlying conditions shifted, the architecture that upheld such extremes could not persist unchanged. Beyond this boundary, contraction began to assert itself, not through sudden devastation, but through gradual tightening. The same processes that once enabled expansion recalibrated, limiting the vertical reach of the ecosystem. Productivity redistributed, variability increased. The space available for extraordinary specialization narrowed until it vanished. In this sense, the predator marks the crest of a wave that had already begun to recede. To call it an upper limit is not to diminish its significance, but to recognize its context. Evolution had explored how far surplus could be translated into solitary power. The result was formidable, yet contingent. When the energetic foundation altered, no equivalent design emerged to surpass or even replicate that form. The ceiling had been tested and found dependent on conditions too fleeting to sustain indefinitely. Earth's systems demonstrate an ability to expand into abundance and then settle into restraint. This restraint does not imply loss of vitality, but a redefinition of balance. The later oceans stabilized at levels where efficiency, cooperation, and broader feeding strategies prevailed over concentrated force. What had once been feasible became untenable, not through failure of the organism, but through reconfiguration of the environment. The permanence of this shift is visible in the prolonged absence that followed. Millions of years passed without the reappearance of a comparable marine mammal adapted for crushing other giants. Such duration suggests that the threshold crossed in the Miocene was not reopened under subsequent climatic regimes. The line drawn by that predator remained uncrossed. In the quiet endurance of its fossil, the boundary becomes clear. It signifies a peak of possibility shaped by particular planetary circumstances and the subsequent stabilization that confined later life to different proportions. The ocean continued, diverse and powerful, yet within revised limits that prevented repetition of that earlier intensity. In deep time, the living world does not circle back out of sentiment. It moves according to pressure, temperature, chemistry, and chance. When a particular form disappears, there is no underlying impulse within evolution to recreate it simply because it once existed. Natural selection works with what is present and profitable under current conditions. It refines the available, not the remembered. The predator that thrived during the Miocene did so because a rare alignment of factors supported its scale and strategy. Circulation patterns delivered steady nutrients. Prey gathered in sufficient density. Climatic gradients allowed a tall trophic structure to persist. Its anatomy was not an inevitable endpoint of whale evolution, but a response to a temporary invitation written into the physics of the ocean. When that invitation expired, the blueprint did not linger awaiting rediscovery. For such a design to return, the same foundational conditions would need to reassemble with comparable stability and duration. Global currents would need to channel surplus energy upward with similar consistency. Large prey populations would have to concentrate predictably over expansive regions. The balance between competition and opportunity would need to tip once more toward solitary dominance. Through the millions of years that followed, continental drift continued, atmospheric composition shifted, and polar configurations evolved along different trajectories. The ocean reorganized around these new parameters. It explored other strategies, enlarging filter feeders, refining cooperative hunters, diversifying mid-level niches. Nowhere did it reconstruct the precise energetic scaffold that had once permitted a bone-crushing giant to dominate. This absence does not signal failure. It reflects the contingent nature of ecological possibility. Evolution thrives on novelty shaped by present constraints. When those constraints favor efficiency and flexibility over concentrated force, the incentive to revisit an earlier extreme disappears. The adaptive landscape has changed. The peaks available to climb are different from those that once stood prominent. Some ecological configurations are singular passages through time. They require a combination of warmth, circulation, geography, and biological inventory unlikely to converge again in the same proportions. As the planetary system drifts further from those parameters, the likelihood of recreating that apex diminishes. Earth does not preserve a catalog of designs to be reopened at will. It advances through constant recalibration, closing certain pathways as new ones emerge. The formidable predator of the Miocene represents a door that has remained shut since its era ended. Its imprint endures in stone, while the conditions that allowed it have continued along their own irreversible course. Imagine an ocean whose chemistry, circulation, and climate align in a configuration that exists only for a narrow span of time. Its waters move with particular rhythms. Nutrients rise in steady pulses. Prey gathers predictably across broad basins. The system does not appear extraordinary to the creatures within it. It simply feels stable and full. Yet, from the vantage point of deep time, that arrangement is temporary, a fleeting pattern in a restless planetary machine. When that pattern dissolves, the living forms tied most closely to it often vanish. It is tempting to describe this as extinction alone, as the loss of species. But beneath the disappearance of bodies lies something quieter and more fundamental. The conditions themselves recede. Circulation routes alter. Climatic gradients shift. The energetic ladder that once stretched so high retracts by degrees. What vanished with the Miocene predator was not merely an organism, but the exact structure of surplus that sustained it. The ocean once possessed an upper limit broad enough to support multiple giants confronting one another directly. It once channeled energy upward in volumes that tolerated repeated loss at the summit. Then, through gradual reorganization, it ceased to do so. The same waters persisted, yet their capacity changed. Such losses are difficult to perceive in the present because the sea always appears complete. It still hosts whales of immense size, predators of striking speed, migrations spanning entire hemispheres. Without the mineral record, there would be little indication that an alternative ceiling once existed. No memory lingers in the waves themselves. The disappearance of a former state leaves no visible scar upon the surface. Fossils serve as reminders of these hidden transitions. They preserve the imprint of ecological architectures no longer active. In enamel thickness and bone density, they capture the magnitude of past energy flow. By comparing strata, one recognizes that certain arrangements of abundance and interaction have no modern equivalent. The difference lies not in vitality, but in scale and configuration. The lost ocean state was not chaotic or mythical. It was a lawful outcome of particular climatic and geographic alignments. When those alignments shifted, the possibility they created withdrew with them. The life supported by that possibility diminished accordingly, leaving behind stone records as evidence of a former latitude in design. Today's seas function within their own boundaries, coherent and dynamic. Yet beneath their continuity rests the knowledge that other versions once existed, versions in which the vertical reach of the food web climbed higher than it does now. The absence of that reach is subtle, detectable only through deep time's patient archive, where extinct conditions reveal themselves through the forms they once allowed. A single lifetime measures the sea in seasons. Storms arrive and fade. Fisheries rise and decline. Shorelines advance by meters, sometimes retreat by the same. Within such narrow frames, change appears immediate, even dramatic. Yet when these observations are placed against the span of millions of years, they become fleeting impressions on a system that reorganizes at a far slower cadence. Human experience depends on memory that stretches across decades at most. We inherit stories from grandparents, record temperatures for a century or two, compare photographs separated by a few generations. From this vantage, the present configuration of the ocean feels long-standing, almost fixed. The predators we know appear timeless. The absence of more extreme forms does not register as absence at all. Earth, however, moves according to intervals far beyond personal recollection. Continents shift over tens of millions of years. Circulation routes alter as gateways open and close. Atmospheric concentrations climb and fall across spans that dwarf civilizations. Within these epochs, ecosystems expand upward, contract, diversify, and simplify. Peaks of abundance and ceilings of possibility rise and settle without regard for human awareness. Without access to deep time, reductions in complexity can resemble equilibrium, a food web that functions smoothly, even if narrower than its predecessor, appears healthy when compared only to recent decades. The disappearance of a former apex strategy leaves no visible gap unless one consults strata laid down long before human presence. In the absence of that comparison, contraction feels like stability. Perspective shifts this impression. Fossils, isotopic signatures, and sediment cores extend memory backward, revealing that today's oceans represent one phase among many. They show that larger overlaps of giants once coexisted, that nutrient distributions once fueled broader vertical reach, and that these arrangements gradually changed. Against this background, what seems normal in the present becomes one configuration within a larger cycle. Scale alters interpretation. When a system operates below a former ceiling, its quiet may conceal reduction rather than completion. Recognizing this does not diminish the vitality of modern seas. It situates them within a longer narrative of fluctuation and limit. The predator of the Miocene stands within that narrative as evidence of a state no longer active. To see only snapshots is to mistake a moment for a constant. Deep time restores proportion, revealing both the grandeur of past expansions and the subtlety with which they can recede. Through that wider lens, the ocean's history becomes less a sequence of isolated curiosities and more a continuum of possibilities, some open, some permanently closed. There are periods in Earth's history when conflict is not an anomaly, but a structural feature of the system itself. In such intervals, predation does not merely occur within the margins of survival, it becomes woven into the architecture of energy flow. The Miocene Ocean reached one of these moments when its abundance supported a density of giants that fed upon one another without destabilizing the tiers below. The formidable predator we have traced was an expression of that architecture, not its cause. Its crushing bite and reinforced skull were responses to a food web already capable of sustaining repeated loss at the top. Large prey were numerous enough to absorb pressure. Nutrient delivery was steady enough to replace what was taken. In this configuration, violence circulated as part of the system's equilibrium. When multiple apex forms coexist at scale, the environment must provide more than opportunity. It must provide surplus beyond immediate necessity. That surplus diffuses tension downward, allowing upper-level confrontations to proceed without starving lower levels. The ocean at that time did not merely tolerate intensity, it facilitated it. Energy climbed the trophic ladder in volumes that permitted specialized hunters to challenge other giants directly. Such a state appears fearsome when imagined from a narrower present perspective, yet it functioned according to ecological balance. The terror was not located in a single creature's anatomy. It resided in the broader arrangement that made such anatomy viable and sustainable. The violence embedded in that era was systemic, distributed across currents, climates, and prey concentrations. Over time, that embedded intensity diminished as underlying parameters shifted, circulation patterns altered, climatic gradients narrowed, productivity redistributed unevenly. With those gradual changes, the scaffolding that supported extreme apex interaction weakened. The ocean did not stage a dramatic reversal. It recalibrated, favoring configurations that required less concentrated force and more distributed strategies. The removal of systemic violence did not empty the sea of predation. Hunts continued, competition persisted, and mortality remained part of marine life. What withdrew was the capacity for overlapping giants to engage at comparable scale under sustained surplus. The upper tiers contracted to forms more closely aligned with fluctuating productivity and narrower margins. Seen through this wider lens, the earlier era reflects a moment when the ocean's internal dynamics permitted confrontation as a defining feature. The later era reflects restraint shaped by changed constraints. Neither state is inherently monstrous or benign. Each corresponds to particular planetary conditions. In the fossilized remnants of that apex predator, one glimpses a time when the sea's own abundance allowed extraordinary intensity to circulate through its depths. When that abundance shifted, the system transformed accordingly, carrying its history forward in quieter proportions. The surface of the planet is never still, even when change unfolds too slowly to perceive. Tectonic plates drift by centimeters each year, reshaping ocean basins over millions of years. Seaways open and narrow. Continental shelves expand, then retreat. These gradual rearrangements redirect the routes through which heat and nutrients circulate. Over time, the geometry of the ocean itself transforms. During the era that supported an abundance of overlapping giants, continental positions and ocean gateways configured currents in a particular pattern. Warm waters moved along predictable paths. Upwelling zones pulsed with steady reliability. Nutrients climbed through the water column in ways that encouraged vertical expansion of the food web. This arrangement did not arise by intention. It emerged from a precise alignment of geography and climate. As plates shifted and polar regions cooled, that alignment changed. Ice sheets grew more persistent. Temperature gradients strengthened or weakened depending on latitude. Circulation cells reorganized, redistributing productivity unevenly. Some regions became more seasonally volatile. Others narrowed in their capacity to sustain prolonged surplus at the highest trophic levels. Climate eventually stabilized under a different balance. The amplitude of warmth that characterized earlier intervals diminished. Productivity patterns adjusted to new constraints. The pathways that once concentrated prey into accessible corridors no longer operated in the same way. Without those corridors, the energetic foundation required for a solitary bone-crushing predator lost coherence. The result was not an immediate collapse, but a gradual withdrawal of possibility. Evolution could no longer rely on a stable, expansive scaffold to support that specific intensity. The ocean continued to generate large animals, intelligent hunters, and extraordinary migrations. Yet, the exact set of circumstances that once elevated the trophic ceiling to accommodate repeated confrontation between giants did not reassemble. Recreating that window would require a convergence of tectonic configuration, climatic warmth, circulation pathways, and biological inventory remarkably similar to the Miocene state. Given the present continental layout and long-term climatic trajectory, such convergence remains improbable. The system now follows a different arc shaped by altered geometry and energy distribution. Time advances, but not in cycles that faithfully reproduce prior epochs. Each era inherits a modified planet. The sea of today rests within basins etched by continued drift and under skies influenced by cumulative atmospheric shifts. The upper limit, defined by that ancient predator, was a feature of a particular planetary arrangement. Once that arrangement dissolved, the threshold dissolved with it. In this sense, the window did not slam shut, it narrowed until it vanished. What remains is a modern ocean stabilized within distinct parameters, dynamic yet bounded by conditions unlikely to reverse toward that earlier configuration. The possibility that once allowed such extreme overlap among giants has passed into deep time, carried forward only in stone. Stone endures where motion fades. Along a desert coast once washed by warmer currents, fragments of jaw and enamel rest within pale sediment, held in silence for millions of years. They do not roar or move. They do not threaten. They simply remain, dense with memory. In their weight is preserved a chapter when the sea extended itself to unusual heights of intensity. That chapter was neither the origin nor the finale. Oceans had surged and withdrawn long before this predator emerged, and they continued to reorganize after it vanished. Continents drifted, climates cooled and warmed, life diversified into new forms. The episode marked by crushing teeth and concentrated surplus was a crest within a far longer rhythm, a moment when planetary systems briefly sustained their most forceful expression at the summit of the food web. The creature at the center of that crest embodies the conditions that shaped it. Its reinforced skull reflects nutrient pathways that once operated with steady reliability. Its massive dentition records prey distributions dense enough to permit direct confrontation between giants. In its absence from later layers lies testimony that those pathways shifted. The living ocean reorganized, yet the stone retains the architecture of that former state. Evidence such as this widens perspective. It reveals that ecosystems are not fixed landscapes, but shifting alignments of energy, climate, and geography. What appears stable in the present often represents only one configuration among many that Earth has tested. The fossil does not argue or speculate. It simply shows that another ceiling once existed, higher than the one now in place. To hold that awareness is to see the sea as part of a continuous planetary narrative. Today's currents, migrations, and predators belong to their own alignment of forces. They carry forward the inheritance of tectonic drift and atmospheric change, shaped by parameters distinct from those that once allowed overlapping giants to dominate. The mineralized remnants along that Peruvian coast form a quiet boundary marker within this narrative. They speak of abundance, translated into solitary power, of conditions that permitted intensity without immediate collapse. They also testify to the limits imposed by gradual recalibration when geography and climate redirected the flow of possibility. As the modern ocean moves under changing skies, its future chapters remain unwritten, yet the stone record invites patient attention. Within it rests an expanded sense of scale, a reminder that what exists now is part of a longer unfolding. If these quiet passages through deep time resonate, remain with them. Stay with the layered histories written in rock and tide, and allow the planet's enduring story to continue, unhurried and vast.